Gold could sit untouched in temples and treasuries, but salt decided who would live, who would eat, and who would rule. Gold was beautiful. Gold was a symbol, but salt was survival. Empires did not rise because they had more gold than their rivals. They rose because they could feed their armies, preserve food, and keep their populations alive through winters, wars, and famines. For much of human history, nothing did this job better than salt. Armies marched for it. States monopolized it. Tax systems were built upon it. When access to it became unjust, people didn't just complain. They rebelled. All over a white mineral we now pour thoughtlessly on our tables. If this seems absurd, it's only because modern abundance has erased from our memory just how fragile survival once was. Forgetting what once held civilization together is almost the definition of civilization itself. To understand how salt was once more valuable than gold, you must step into a world without refrigerators, global supply chains, chemical preservatives, or the luxury of wasting food. In the ancient and medieval world, food wasn't a matter of comfort. It was a constant problem. Meat spoiled quickly. Harvests were seasonal. One bad year meant famine. One disrupted supply route could mean collapse. Cities were fragile organisms, always one winter away from disaster. Salt solved this problem, not because it was tasty, but because it preserved life. Salt drew moisture out of food, halting the spread of bacteria. It allowed meat and fish to be stored for months instead of days. It made it possible to feed armies far from home, to stockpile grain and protein, to support urban populations that didn't produce their own food. So salt wasn't a spice. It was infrastructure. Gold could store wealth. Salt created it. This distinction is more important than we think. Gold is valuable because people agree it's valuable. Salt was valuable because biology demanded it. The human body needs sodium to survive. So do livestock. Without it, food systems collapse. This made salt non-optional. And when something becomes non-optional, it becomes a source of power. The ancient world understood this instinctively. The Romans built roads specifically to transport salt. The most famous, the Via Salaria, ran from the saltworks on the Adriatic coast into the interior of Italy. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt rations. This practice later evolved into monetary payment and left a linguistic trace we still use today. The word salary began not as an abstract compensation, but as access to life. Where salt flowed, civilization followed. But salt had a feature that made it particularly useful for states. It was geographically limited. Not every region could easily produce it. Some places had salt mines. Others relied on evaporating seawater. Many had neither. This meant salt routes were predictable, production sites were limited, and control was possible. And where control was possible, taxation wasn't far behind. This is where salt ceased to be just a resource and became a political weapon. States quickly realized that if you controlled salt, you didn't need to aggressively tax income or land. You could tax survival itself. People could evade wealth taxes. They couldn't evade the need to eat. Salt was consumed by everyone, every day, in predictable amounts. It was the perfect taxable commodity, essential, visible, and unavoidable. In China, imperial salt monopolies existed for centuries, dating back to the Han Dynasty. By controlling production and distribution, the state used salt revenue to fund armies, bureaucracies, and expansion. In Europe, medieval kingdoms imposed heavy salt taxes, regulating who could buy how much and at what price. Smuggling wasn't just illegal. It was seen as a serious crime because it threatened the state's revenue base. This wasn't greed. It was strategy. When survival goods fund the state becomes deeply invested in controlling daily life. Salt wasn't expensive because it was rare. It was expensive because it was regulated. And regulation turned necessity into leverage. This was seen most clearly in France's infamous salt tax, known as the gabelle. The tax wasn't applied equally. Some regions paid more than others. Some were forced to buy a minimum amount, whether they needed it or not. Penalties for evasion were severe. For a rural population already living on the edge, salt wasn't just costly. It was humiliating. The tax consumed not just money, but legitimacy. People didn't revolt overnight. They smuggled. They cheated. They resented. And slowly, resentment turned into something more dangerous. Salt didn't single-handedly cause the French Revolution, but it taught millions a powerful lesson. When the state unjustly monetizes the conditions of survival, loyalty wears thin quickly. This pattern wasn't unique to Europe. In Africa, salt was transported in huge caravans across the Sahara, traded directly for gold in regions where metal was plentiful but salt was scarce. In some parts of West Africa, blocks of salt were weighed against gold dust at a 1-to-1 value. From a modern perspective, this may seem absurd. But for people in a hot climate with no means of preservation, it was perfect logic. If your food rots, gold has no value. Salt shaped trade routes, determined the location of cities, and influenced the rise and fall of empires. Control the salt, control the logistics, control the logistics, control the power. It didn't glitter, it didn't impress, but it quietly, ruthlessly, and unapologetically determined outcomes. For centuries, this is how it worked. But like any system built on scarcity, salt's power depended on constraints. Geography limited production. Technology limited preservation. And these constraints gave states leverage, until one day they lost that leverage. Because, eventually, technology changed the equation. And when it did, salt didn't pop like a bubble. It didn't collapse in a crisis. It just quietly, permanently, lost its leverage. This is where the story becomes unsettling, because salt was never unique. It was just the first essential commodity we learned to control. Salt lost its power not through revolt or collapse, but through technology. Refrigeration, canning, industrial food processing, and modern logistics slowly broke the ancient link between salt and survival. Food no longer needed aggressive preservation to last through winter or war. Supply chains widened. Production soared. What was once scarce became abundant. What was once essential became invisible. Salt didn't fall from grace. It faded into the background of daily life. And with this shift came something important. Power moved. States that once relied on salt taxes quietly replaced them with other revenue streams. Monopolies dissolved. Smuggling dried up. When salt became cheap, no one marched in protest. Because cheap salt meant full stomachs. The most powerful commodity of the ancient world didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it stopped being a bottleneck. This detail matters, because history tells us not just what was valuable. It tells us why it was valuable, and what happened when that why changed. Salt was never special, because it was white, mineral, or ancient. Salt was important because it sat at the intersection of three forces: necessity, control, and invisibility. People didn't think about it until it was gone. States didn't proclaim their dependence on it. And when access was restricted, the consequences were immediate and human. Hunger doesn't wait for ideology. This pattern didn't die with salt. It has repeated again and again. Today, we no longer organize empires around salt mines or evaporation ponds. But we continue to organize power around essential things most people barely notice until they're interrupted. Energy, data, water, shipping lanes, semiconductors, payment systems. These are the modern salt equivalents. Not flashy, not romantic, but absolutely decisive. No one celebrates when the electricity works. They panic when it doesn't. No one praises logistics when shelves are full. They riot when aisles are empty. These systems are designed to fade into the background because their real value is providing psychological stability. As long as basic needs flow smoothly, societies feel normal. When they don't, trust collapses faster than prices. This is where salt becomes a lesson for modern finance. Inflation hurts most not when luxury goods rise in price. It hurts when essentials do. When energy costs spike, when food prices climb, when rent takes a larger share of income, people don't just feel poorer, they feel trapped. The margin for error shrinks. Survival becomes expensive. And when survival gets expensive, politics grows unstable quickly. This isn't theory, it's pattern recognition. Every major social rupture in history follows pressure on basic necessities. Not because people are irrational, but because biology doesn't negotiate. You can postpone buying gold. You can't postpone eating. You can delay investing. You can't delay heating your home. Systems that over-aggressively monetize the conditions of survival don't just extract income. They extract legitimacy. Salt taught states this lesson early. Some learned to be measured. Others did not. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The most powerful economic systems aren't built around what people admire. They're built around what they depend on. Gold dazzles. Stocks excite. Speculation entertains. But real power hides in the boring infrastructure that does its job quietly, and then suddenly doesn't. Salt was boring. That's why it worked. It didn't promise wealth. It promised continuity. And continuity is the bedrock of any stable system. Empires understood this when they secured grain routes before minting coins. Modern governments understand it when they prioritize energy security over short-term growth, even if they don't always admit it. Real wealth isn't just about accumulation. It's about controlling essentials without triggering revolt. It's about managing scarcity without weaponizing it. It's about understanding where the leverage is and where it becomes dangerous. Salt also offers a quieter lesson about financial freedom. People often think freedom comes from having more assets. History shows it comes from reducing dependence on fragile systems. When the cost of survival is low and predictable, societies gain stability. When it's volatile and manipulated, instability follows. This is true at both the state and personal level. The less of your income goes to mere survival, the more room you have to adapt, invest, and think long-term. Gold didn't give that freedom. Salt did. And when salt ceased to be scarce, power didn't disappear. It just moved. To energy markets, to financial infrastructure, to data flows, to the silent systems most people never see, but everyone relies on. This is why history repeats this pattern. Not because leaders are foolish, but because incentives are ruthless. Control the essentials, control behavior. Lose control, and legitimacy evaporates. Salt was one of the first commodities to teach humanity this lesson clearly. Not because it was rare, but because it was necessary. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was inevitable. And this is the final, enduring insight. Value isn't fixed. It's contextual. It changes with technology, geography, and dependency. What matters isn't what shines, but what sustains. Systems rise not around luxuries, but around necessities, and they collapse when the cost of survival becomes unbearable. Empires didn't rise because they had more gold than their rivals. They rose because they understood what people couldn't live without and built their power around it. Salt decided who would eat, who would march, who would endure. And though we no longer trade it for gold, the logic it revealed continues to govern the financial system we live in today.